The morning Elsie Sullivan buried her husband, 3 men told her the ranch would be dead before the first frost came. She stood at the grave site on the eastern slope of her land, red Wyoming dirt still fresh on her hands, the September wind pulling strands of dark hair across her face, and she listened to every single word those men said. She listened to Reverend Holbrook, who meant well but spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had never once driven cattle in his life. She listened to her neighbor Gerald Pratt, who owned the largest spread in Cotter County and who had been after her husband's water rights for 3 years. She listened to her own brother-in-law, Douglas Sullivan, who traveled all the way from Denver to attend the funeral and who, in the same breath as his condolences, offered to take the property off her hands at a fair price, because a woman alone, he said, with a small daughter and no hired men, simply could not run a cattle ranch in this country. Not in 1882. Not anywhere. Elsie was 31 years old. Her daughter, Clara, was 6. The Sullivan Ranch sat on 420 acres of the finest grassland in Carbon County, Wyoming Territory, with a creek that ran cold and clear through the southern pasture, and a herd of 112 head that her husband, Thomas Sullivan, had spent 12 years building up from nothing. She looked at Douglas across her husband's grave. She looked at Gerald Pratt. She looked at the Reverend. And then she looked out past all of them, past the cottonwood trees and the distant ridge where the sky met the land in a clean, unbroken line, and she made herself a promise so deep and so private that she never said it out loud to a single person. She was going to keep this ranch. She was going to run it, grow it, and hand it to her daughter in better shape than she had received it. And then she walked back to the house. The first winter was the worst. Thomas had handled all of the finances, all of the cattle contracts, all of the arrangements with the cattle buyers in Rawlins, and Elsie spent the better part of 3 months learning everything he had known, sitting at the kitchen table long after Clara was asleep, going through every ledger and every letter and every contract by the light of an oil lamp until her eyes burned. She discovered that Thomas had borrowed against the South 40 acres to buy a bull the previous spring, a magnificent Hereford named King, and that the note was due in April. She discovered that one of their 2 hired hands, a man named Pete Colby, had been skimming feed money for the better part of a year. She dismissed Pete Colby in January and did not replace him, because she could not afford to. She kept the other hand, an older Mexican man named Rogelio Vega, who had worked the Sullivan land for 6 years and who treated her with complete and straightforward respect, and who taught her more about cattle in those first 6 months than she had learned in her entire prior life. Rogelio was 53 years old and had worked ranches from Sonora to the Montana border. He had strong, weathered hands and a quiet manner that never wavered, and he knew when to speak and when to work in silence, which was a quality Elsie valued more than almost anything else during that first bleak winter. He showed her how to read the signs of sickness in the herd before it spread. He showed her the proper way to check a cow's feet for rot before it could cripple the animal. He showed her how to calculate feed needs against the length of winter, and how to ration hay without starving the herd. He did all of this without a trace of condescension, which was more than could be said for most of the men who came around in those early months, offering advice she had not asked for, and watching her with the poorly concealed expectation that she would fail. She did not fail. She made the payment on the South 40 in April by selling 2 steers she had fattened through the winter specifically for that purpose, a plan she had calculated down to the dollar on paper and executed without a single deviation. Gerald Pratt came by in May to offer again to buy her out, this time at a slightly lower price than he had offered Douglas Sullivan in September, and Elsie told him politely, but without any warmth whatsoever, that she was not interested, and would he like some coffee before he rode back, and he declined and left with the sour expression of a man who did not enjoy hearing no from a woman. The summer of 1883 was good. The grass was high, and the water held, and Elsie sold 60 head in Rawlins at a price that left her with enough money to repair the main barn roof, hire a seasonal hand named Danny Forsyth to help with the drive, and set aside a small savings against next winter. She came home from Rawlins with Clara riding beside her on the wagon seat, the little girl sunburned and chattering about the horses she had seen at the stockyards, and Elsie felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt since before Thomas died. It was not happiness exactly, or not yet, but it was the solid feeling of ground under her feet. It was competence. It was hers. The years that followed were not easy, but they were not impossible either, and Elsie learned the difference between hardship and disaster, which is a lesson that only the land can teach properly. There were hard winters and dry summers. There were cows lost to illness and one catastrophic month in 1885, when a late blizzard killed 11 calves and cost her a significant portion of the season's profit. There was a fence dispute with Gerald Pratt in 1886 that required a lawyer from Rawlins and 3 months of negotiation, which Elsie won cleanly because she had kept meticulous records of every boundary marker and every conversation and every letter. And Pratt's surveyor ultimately confirmed that the fence he had moved 40 feet onto her land needed to come back. Pratt moved his fence. He did not offer to buy her out again after that. There was the matter of respectability, which was a complicated thing for a widow running a ranch alone in the Wyoming Territory in the 1880s. The town of Millhaven, which sat 8 miles to the northwest of the Sullivan property on the Rawlins Road, had its opinions about Elsie Sullivan, and they were not all kind. There were women who did not invite her to their social gatherings because they did not know what category she fit into. Not quite a wife, and not quite a man, and not quite a business person in any sense they were comfortable with. There were men who spoke to her with the careful, slightly puzzled politeness, reserved for people who were doing something they were not supposed to be doing, but who were doing it well enough that you could not quite find fault. The minister's wife, a kind-hearted woman named Helen Graves, was the first person in Millhaven who treated Elsie with complete and uncomplicated friendship. Helen visited the Sullivan Ranch one afternoon in the spring of 1884 with a pie and no agenda, and she sat at the kitchen table and talked with Elsie for 2 hours about horses, and about the difficulty of finding decent fabric in Millhaven, and about whether the new schoolteacher was as bad as everyone said. And when she left, she hugged Elsie at the door and told her she was doing a remarkable thing, and that anyone who said otherwise could go straight to the devil. Elsie laughed for the first time in a long time that afternoon. Clara grew up on the back of a horse and with a book in her hand because Elsie insisted on both. The child had her mother's dark eyes and her father's easy laugh, and an absolute fearlessness around animals that sometimes made Elsie's heart clench with worry, and with pride in equal measure. By the time Clara was 10, she could ride every acre of the Sullivan Ranch and name every water hole and every rock formation, and every particular character of every cow in the herd. By the time she was 12, she was doing the morning feed check alongside Rogelio without being asked, which was the highest compliment the old man ever paid to anyone. He simply started including her in his rounds as if it were a matter of course, and Clara never made it into a big occasion, just pulled on her boots and went. Elsie watched her daughter becoming someone strong and capable and unhardened, which was the precise combination she had been working toward without ever quite putting it into words, and she felt in those moments a quiet, enormous satisfaction that needed no audience. She was building something. She could see it in the healthy cattle and the repaired fences and the new water trough she had installed in the north pasture in 1887, and she could see it in her daughter's straight back and calm eyes. She was building something real. By 1889, the year Wyoming was preparing to become a state, the Sullivan Ranch had grown. Elsie had purchased the adjacent 30-acre parcel to the west when old Hector Finch died, and his heirs wanted nothing to do with the land, and she had expanded the herd to over 170 head. She had added a second bunkhouse for seasonal hands, a proper root cellar behind the main house, and a new chicken coop that Clara had largely designed herself. She had also, through patient and careful breeding, developed a reputation for producing particularly sound, well-tempered horses that sold reliably and well at the Rawlins market, a reputation that had spread by word of mouth the way good reputations always do, slowly and solidly, until people were coming to her specifically rather than finding her by accident. Rogelio had slowed some in recent years. His knees troubled him in cold weather, and he had developed a cough the previous winter that had worried Elsie considerably. But he had recovered by spring, and he refused any suggestion of reducing his work with a dignified stubbornness that she respected, and did not push against too hard. She had taken on a younger hand named Wilcaster 2 years earlier, a quiet 24-year-old from New Mexico who knew horses well, and who worked hard without needing to be managed, which was Elsie's primary requirement in a hired hand. The thing about running a ranch alone for almost 10 years is that it changes the shape of a person in ways they cannot entirely see from the inside. Elsie Sullivan, at 40 years old, was not the same woman who had stood at her husband's grave in 1882. She was leaner, tougher, and more certain of herself in the practical matters of cattle and land, and money than most men twice her age. She had developed a way of listening to people that was disconcerting to those who were used to filling silence with words, a quality of complete and level attention that made some people feel she was seeing through them, and others feel that they had been genuinely heard. Her hands were not soft. Her opinions were not vague. She did not apologize for things that were not her fault. But she was also, and she knew this in the private hours after Clara was in bed and the ranch was quiet, and the Wyoming night pressed its enormous dark weight against the windows, lonely in a way she had never quite found the words for. Not desperate in it, not crushed by it, but present in it, the way a healed scar is still present in the skin. She had built a life of tremendous substance. She had raised a daughter of extraordinary quality. She had proven every doubting man in Carbon County wrong 10 times over. But the evenings were long, and the bed on Thomas's side had been cold for nearly a decade, and there were moments when the silence of the house after Clara slept felt less like peace and more like something waiting. She did not do anything about this feeling. She had tried once briefly in 1887, allowing the attentions of a recently widowed wheat farmer from the eastern part of the county, a decent enough man named Harold Briggs who had called on her formally twice, and who had been dull in a way that was not his fault but that was also not a problem she could solve. She had thanked him kindly and let the thing expire, and she had not tried again, and she had largely made her peace with that. She had a great deal. She had built a great deal. It was enough. It was nearly enough. It was a Monday morning in April of 1892, a morning that started in the most ordinary way imaginable, that changed everything. Elsie was in the south pasture checking the condition of a young cow who had been off her feed for 2 days, kneeling in the grass with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, when she heard hoofbeats on the road from Millhaven. She did not look up immediately. Riders passed on that road regularly, and she was in the middle of examining the cow's hooves. She found a small stone lodged in the near forefoot, worked it free carefully with the hoof pick she kept in her vest pocket, and then straightened and looked. A man had stopped his horse at the gate to her southern drive. He was sitting his horse well, which she noticed first, because a man who sits his horse well usually has something else going for him. He was broad through the shoulders with a trail-worn look that told her he had been riding for some days. His hat was pushed back slightly on his head, and he was looking at her property. Not at her, at the land. He was looking at it the way she had seen very few men look at land, with the kind of focused, appreciative attention that meant he understood what he was looking at. She walked toward him, pulling her sleeves down as she went. He saw her coming and swung down from his horse before she reached the fence. He was tall, taller than she had initially gauged from a distance, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was not pretty but was entirely honest. Dark brown eyes, a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 4 days. He was, she would estimate, somewhere in his late 30s, perhaps 38 or 39. "Morning," he said. He held his hat in his hands and he looked at her directly without being forward about it, which was a balance not every man managed. "I was told in town there might be work available on this ranch. My name is Amos Blackwell." Elsie stopped on her side of the fence and looked at him carefully. "Who told you that in town?" "Woman at the general store. Mrs. Graves, I believe." Helen Graves, who had a habit of arranging things she thought needed arranging. Elsie filed that away for later. "I have 2 hands already," she said. "Yes, ma'am. She mentioned that. She also mentioned you were going into the spring drive with a larger herd than last year and that you'd taken on a new parcel to the west that needed work before summer." All of that was true. The west parcel's fence line was in poor condition, and the water trough there was cracked and needed replacing, and she had been turning over in her mind for 3 weeks whether to hire seasonal help or manage with Will and Rogelio. "Where are you coming from?" she asked. "Most recently Montana, before that Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. I've been working cattle since I was 17 years old." He said it without swagger, as a plain fact. "You have references?" "I have a letter from Carver Ranch in Billings. I have another from the Box W down in New Mexico. I can get more if those aren't enough. It'll just take time." "What kind of work did you do on those ranches?" "Everything," he said, and then, because everything was too broad, he continued. "Cattle work primarily, some horse breaking, fence repair. I have built 2 water systems from scratch. I can read a herd and I can find trouble before it becomes catastrophic, which is probably the most useful thing about me." She studied him for another moment. He did not fidget under the inspection, which was also something she noted. "Come around to the main gate," she said. "I'll look at those letters." The letters were good. The one from Carver Ranch in Billings was written in the hand of a man who clearly did not write often, and was therefore being very careful and choosing only words he meant. And what he wrote about Amos Blackwell was short and entirely positive. "He is thorough with cattle and honest with money," which were the 2 qualities Elsie required above all others. The letter from Box W was longer and warmer, written by a woman named Grace Wheeler, who ran the ranch herself, and who wrote that Amos Blackwell was the best hand she had employed in 20 years, that he had treated her and her operation with complete respect, and that she was sorry to lose him when he decided to move north. A woman rancher's recommendation carried particular weight with Elsie, and she thought Grace Wheeler probably knew that when she wrote the letter. She folded the letters and handed them back. "I'll offer you a monthly wage and a bunk in the new bunkhouse. The work is hard and it starts before sunrise. If you're here for a week and it's not a good fit on either side, we part ways without hard feelings." "That's fair," he said. "There's a 3rd hand already, Rogelio Vega. He's been here 12 years and this ranch runs the way he understands it to run. You take any issue with his methods to me, not to him directly." "Understood." She looked at him once more, measuring. "Get your horse settled in the east paddock. Rogelio will show you the bunkhouse." Amos Blackwell had been on the Sullivan Ranch for approximately 40 minutes when Elsie heard him speaking with Rogelio in the barn, and she stopped near the barn door without going in, not to eavesdrop exactly, but because she wanted to hear how he spoke to the older man. She had learned long ago that how a person behaves when they do not know they are being watched is considerably more informative than how they behave when they think they are being evaluated. She heard Amos ask Rogelio about the layout of the south pasture, and she heard him ask it with a genuine question in his voice, the tone of a man who actually wants to know the answer. She heard Rogelio respond, briefly at first and then more fully as Amos asked a follow-up question that showed he had actually listened to the first answer. She heard Rogelio say something about the temperament of the big Hereford bull who had replaced King and who had a tendency to be difficult at the south gate, and she heard Amos laugh, a real laugh, short and warm. She went back to the house. The first week passed. Amos Blackwell worked with a consistency and a quality that she had not seen in a hand since the early days with Rogelio. He was on the property before sunrise every morning without being instructed, and he stayed until the work was done each evening without being reminded. He found a drainage problem on the west parcel fence line that neither Elsie nor Will had noticed, a slow erosion that would have undermined 3 fence posts within the year, and he repaired it correctly without making any announcement about having found it, simply did the work, and then reported it to Elsie briefly and without performance. He handled the cattle with a quiet competence that Rogelio watched, and then gave a small, decisive nod about, which was the highest available praise from that quarter. At the end of the first week, Elsie told him he could stay on through the summer drive. He said thank you, simply and without excess, and went back to work. Clara, who was 16 that spring and who had her mother's precise eye for quality in people and horses both, watched Amos Blackwell for the first 3 days from a distance, and then apparently decided he was acceptable, because she began greeting him in the mornings when he passed the house, and occasionally asking him questions about his horse, a large gray gelding named Porter, who was a genuinely striking animal, and who Clara had taken an immediate interest in. Amos answered her questions about Porter with the same honest directness he applied to everything, treating her as the intelligent young person she was rather than as a child to be managed, which Clara noticed and appreciated with her characteristic straightforward lack of ceremony. Elsie noticed this too. She noticed a great deal about Amos Blackwell in those first weeks, and she was somewhat annoyed with herself for how much she noticed. She noticed the way he moved through work, unhurried and completely focused. She noticed that he ate his meals in the bunkhouse without complaint about the food, which Will Castor had not always done. She noticed that when he was not working, he was often sitting outside the bunkhouse in the evening reading from a small, battered book, which surprised her enough that she asked once, passing, what the book was. "History," he said, looking up. "This one is about the Spanish exploration of the Southwest. I was in that country for years, and I wanted to understand something about how it came to look the way it does." "And does it," she asked, "help you understand?" He considered the question seriously, which she liked. "Some," he said. "It mostly makes me want to ask more questions." She had walked on after that, but she thought about that answer for the better part of a week. In early May, Elsie rode the fence line of the north pasture and found a section that needed more repair than she had budgeted time for before the spring drive. She rode back to the barn to get additional wire, and Amos was there. And without any real plan, she described the problem to him, and he said he would ride out and look at it, and she said she would come along. And so they rode the north fence line together, which was the first time they had been in any space that was not the general occupied territory of a working ranch, and the conversation that happened on that ride was different from conversations that had happened before, not in topic but in quality. He asked her about the history of the Sullivan property, how long the family had held it, how she had developed the horse breeding program. She told him about Thomas, briefly and without drama, just the facts of the purchase and the early years and his death. He listened. He did not fill the space after she mentioned Thomas's death with awkward comfort or with the particular kind of uncomfortable silence that most people produced around her widowhood. He simply let the information exist, and then asked her a thoughtful question about the early cattle contracts, which let them move forward naturally. She asked him about Montana, and he described it with a specificity that showed he had paid close attention to every place he had lived. He talked about the particular quality of the light in the Bitterroot Valley in autumn, and he talked about a problem with water rights on the Carver Ranch that had gone to county arbitration and been settled in Carver's favor partly because of records Amos himself had helped assemble. He talked about it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who cares about fairness as a practical matter, not as a performance. By the time they had assessed the fence line and turned back toward the ranch, the sun was beginning to tilt toward afternoon, and the conversation had covered an entirely disproportionate amount of ground for two people who had only met a few weeks ago. Elsie felt something unfamiliar in her chest, a warmth that was not uncomfortable but that she eyed with a certain careful suspicion, the way you eye an animal you are not sure of yet. She said very little on the ride back. He matched her quiet without difficulty. Over the following weeks, as the ranch moved into the full work of late spring, something was developing between them that neither of them named. It was not in any particular gesture or declaration. It was in the way a conversation would begin in the course of work and continue longer than the work required. It was in the small, deliberate courtesies he extended, holding a gate, or bringing her the specific tool she was reaching for before she had to reach for it, not in the fussy way of someone trying to impress, but in the natural way of someone who is paying attention. It was in the way she had begun to include him in certain decisions, not because his help was strictly necessary, but because she found herself wanting to hear what he thought. On a Thursday evening in the second week of May, Elsie came out of the house with a pot of coffee to bring to the hands in the bunkhouse, which was something she did perhaps twice a week, and which was an entirely ordinary event, and she found Amos sitting on the fence of the east paddock watching Porter and the other horses in the last light of the day. He was not reading. He was simply watching the horses, with that quality of complete attention he brought to everything, and for a moment she stood on the porch and watched him watching them, and there was nothing transactional or calculated about the feeling that moved through her then. It was just feeling, wide and clean as the sky over the ridge. She brought him a cup of coffee and stayed. They talked for an hour in the evening light, leaning on the fence rail, about horses mostly and then about other things, and at some point Clara called from the house that supper was ready, and Elsie pushed back from the fence and said good night and walked back across the yard, and she could feel the warmth of his attention between her shoulder blades as she went. She slept badly that night, not unhappily, but with the restlessness of a person in whom something has been set in motion. The following Saturday Rogelio asked to speak with her privately, which he almost never did, and he came to the kitchen and sat at the table and folded his hands and told her, in his careful and measured way, that in his professional opinion Amos Blackwell was the finest working cowboy he had encountered in his 35 years of ranch work, and that if she was considering keeping him past the summer drive she should make that offer clearly and soon, because a man of that quality would not stay unspoken for long. He said it with his eyes on his folded hands, and then he looked up at her briefly and then back down, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was talking about more than professional terms, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything about that. "I'll think on it," Elsie said. "Yes, ma'am," Rogelio said, and went back to work. The spring drive took place in the last days of May, moving 78 head to Rawlins over 3 days, and it was the smoothest drive the Sullivan Ranch had run in years. Amos and Will and Danny Forsythe, who she had brought back as a seasonal hand for the second year running, worked together as if they had done it for a decade, and Amos read the cattle and the terrain with a practiced ease that kept the drive moving steadily without strain. On the second evening, camped beside the creek east of the ridge, Elsie was sitting by the fire after supper, and Amos came and sat across the fire from her, and they were alone because the others had already turned in. He said without preamble, "This is the finest spread I have ever seen." She looked at him across the fire. "I have been on ranches across 5 territories in 2 states," he said. "I have worked for good outfits and bad ones. I have seen land managed well and managed into the ground. What you have built here is exceptional, Mrs. Sullivan. The condition of the cattle, the breeding quality of the horses, the infrastructure of the property, the records you keep." He paused. "I don't say that to be flattering. I say it because it is the truth, and I think you should hear it plainly." Elsie held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the fire for a moment before she looked at him again. "The town had some opinions about whether it could be done." "I know," he said. "Rogelio told me something about the early years. Rogelio talks more than he lets on." He does, Amos said, and there was a small, warm smile on his face. I was not going to let it fail, she said. I didn't see that as an option. No, he said, looking at her steadily. I don't imagine you did. There was a quiet between them then that had a different quality than ordinary quiet. It held something that both of them were aware of and neither of them moved toward directly. The fire crackled. Somewhere beyond the camp a coyote called once and was silent. You said you've been moving from place to place since you were 17, she said, more or less. Is that by preference or by circumstance? He was quiet for a moment. For a long time I didn't distinguish between the two very clearly, he said. I think in the last few years I've started to want to distinguish between them. She understood what he meant by that, or she thought she did, and she put it carefully aside in her mind to examine later, the way you put aside a thing that is too valuable or too fragile to handle in the moment. They got the herd to Rawlins without incident. The price was good, better than good. Better than any year she had negotiated before, partly because her reputation for stock quality had preceded her, and partly because she had done her research on the market price before she left the ranch, and she knew exactly what the floor of acceptable was, and she held it, pleasantly and completely immovably, until the buyers met it. Amos watched her negotiate without interfering and without the particular discomfort that some men showed when a woman was conducting business effectively, and afterward when they were loading the wagon with supplies for the return trip he said, simply, "That was well done." And she said, "Yes, it was," with a satisfaction she no longer bothered to modulate. The ride home from Rawlins took 2 days. They camped the first night near the same creek as on the drive out, and this time Clara was with them, having accompanied the supply wagon back. And she sat beside Amos at the fire and asked him about the horses he had broken in Montana, and he told her with that easy, engaged quality he had, and Elsie watched her daughter laughing at something he said and felt a complicated happiness at the sight. On the second afternoon they rode into the Sullivan Ranch in the low gold light of late afternoon, the ranch buildings familiar and sturdy against the darkening sky, and Elsie felt the particular, profound satisfaction of coming home to something she had built, a feeling she never quite got over or wanted to get over. The house, the barn, the paddocks, the pastures rolling away to the south with the creek catching the last light like a ribbon of silver. It was hers. Every board and fence post and watered acre of it was hers, bought with 10 years of solitary, determined work. She stood in the yard looking at it for a moment before going in, and she became aware that Amos had stopped beside her and was looking at the same view. "There it is," he said quietly. "There it is," she agreed. She did not make the offer to keep him through the fall that week or the week after. She was aware that the thing between them was developing into something she had not strictly planned for, and she was moving with careful deliberateness, not out of coldness, but out of the habit of a person who has made every important decision in her life by herself, and who has learned to make them slowly and well. But June passed, and July came, hot and dry and full of work, and Amos remained and worked and was every day exactly who he had been the day before, which was itself a remarkable thing, and the conversations between them had deepened and lengthened in a way that felt organic and necessary rather than constructed. He was helping her repair the water trough on the west parcel on a Tuesday afternoon in July, when he told her something about himself that she had not asked, but that she had wondered about. He told her, without any particular drama, that he had been married once briefly to a woman in New Mexico when he was 24, and that she had died in childbirth a year after their wedding, and the child with her, and that he had left New Mexico soon after and had not stayed anywhere very long since then. He said it in the middle of working, not looking at her, and she absorbed it the way he had absorbed her account of Thomas, letting it simply be true without adding anything to it that it did not need. "I am sorry," she said, which was insufficient and also exactly right. "It was a long time ago," he said, 14 years. It doesn't always stay where it belongs in time." He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that she recognized because she had felt it herself. The particular grief of loss that has been carried for so long it has become part of the internal architecture. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They worked in silence for a while, and then talked about other things, and somewhere in the afternoon the conversation became easy again, and Elsie thought that they had passed through something together without either of them naming it, and that the passing through it had changed the distance between them in some way she could feel but not precisely measure. Clara noticed. Of course she did. Clara at 16 had her mother's powers of observation and considerably fewer filters on what she did with what she observed. And one evening at supper she said, entirely calmly and with her eyes on her plate, that she thought Amos was a very good man, and that he clearly thought a great deal of her mother. And Elsie put down her fork and looked at her daughter with an expression that hovered between amusement and exasperation, and said that she appreciated Clara's opinion and would Clara like more biscuits. "I'm just saying," Clara said. "I know what you're just saying," Elsie said. Clara smiled into her plate and reached for the biscuits herself. Rogelio said nothing further on the subject. He had said what he had to say, and he considered it done, which was entirely in character. The thing that moved it forward happened on a Wednesday evening in August. Elsie had come out onto the porch after supper, as she sometimes did, to sit with the evening and think through the work of the coming days, and Amos had come across the yard, not with any particular destination apparent, and stopped at the porch steps. "May I?" he said, indicating the chair beside hers. "Of course," she said. He sat. The evening was warm and the sky was extraordinary, the full weight of the summer stars beginning to appear as the last of the daylight faded, the Milky Way assembling itself above the ridge with its characteristic grandeur. They sat in silence for several minutes, which was comfortable. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it correctly, so you'll have to forgive me if I take some time with it." She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the stars. He had his hands on the arms of the chair, and his posture was that of a man who is choosing his words very deliberately. "I am a man who has worked other people's land for 21 years, he said. "I have done it well and I don't regret any of it, but I am 39 years old and I have been in one place longer than a season only twice in my life, and I find that I am more attached to this ranch and to the people on it than I have been to any place in a very long time, and I think you deserve to know that plainly." Elsie's hands were still in her lap. She did not say anything. "I am not a man of great means," he continued. "I have some savings and a good horse and 21 years of skills that are useful in this particular world. I have no property to bring and no family name that would mean anything to you. I know that. I also know that you have built something extraordinary here, entirely through your own strength and judgment, and I would not insult it or you by suggesting that you need anything from me." He turned from the stars then and looked at her, and the steadiness in his face was complete. "But I think about you when I'm not near you," he said. "And when I am near you, I think about things more clearly than I do otherwise. And I believe, although I could be wrong, that you don't find my company entirely without value." A small, involuntary sound escaped her, something that was almost a laugh and almost not. "No," she said, "I don't find it without value." "Then I would like to court you, Elsie, if you'll allow it, formally and honestly and at whatever pace suits you." The night was very still. From the south pasture she could hear the faint sound of the cattle settling, and the creek's distant voice, and the particular silence of the Wyoming sky pressing down on all of it. She had spent 10 years making decisions alone. She was very good at it. But she was also aware, sitting in the warm August dark beside this steady, honest, attentive man, that there was a difference between not needing something and not wanting it. She had never needed anyone's help to run this ranch. She had proved that beyond any reasonable argument. But wanting, which was a different country entirely, was something she had kept at a careful distance for a long time, and she could feel now that the distance had been closing for months without her fully acknowledging it. "I will allow it," she said. Her voice was even but her hands were not entirely still. He exhaled slowly, and she understood from that breath how much the question had cost him to ask, how carefully he had been carrying it. "Thank you," he said. And then, after a moment, "What does courting mean on this ranch?" "It means you have supper at the house instead of the bunkhouse on Sundays," she said. "It means that you ride with me when I check the south pasture and we talk about things. It means that you are honest with me about everything, and I am honest with you about everything, which I will require regardless." "I can do all of that," he said. "I know you can," she said. They sat on the porch until the stars were fully out and the night had deepened around them, talking quietly about nothing in particular, and it was the most pleasant evening Elsie Sullivan could remember in years. The Sunday suppers became a ritual and a pleasure. Clara, who was almost viciously perceptive, monitored the proceedings with the proprietary interest of someone who feels personally responsible for a good outcome, and who is not wrong about it. She engaged Amos at the table with questions about horses and cattle and history, partly because she was genuinely interested and partly, Elsie suspected, because she was establishing her own sense of who he was independent of her mother's impression, which was exactly what she should be doing and which Elsie respected. Amos passed every test Clara put him to, not because he was trying to, but because he was consistent, and consistency is ultimately the only test that matters. In September, on a Sunday afternoon when Clara had ridden over to visit Helen Graves's daughter in town, Amos and Elsie sat on the porch after supper and he asked her about Thomas. Not about the ranch or the death, but about the man. About what kind of person he had been. She was quiet for a moment before she answered, gathering the right words. "He was a good man," she said. "He was kind and he worked hard and he loved this land and he loved Clara and me. He was not, I think, as strong as I needed him to be in his final years, and that was not his fault. The illness took something from him before the end, but it meant I had to become stronger than I had been or thought I could be." She paused. "I am grateful for what he was and I have forgiven what he couldn't be. He did not know what I was capable of, but then neither did I. He would be proud of what you've built," Amos said. "Perhaps," she said. "I stopped thinking about that some years ago. I built it for Clara and for myself and because the land deserved to be kept properly. That's enough reason." "It is," he said. He took her hand then for the first time with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic. He took it and held it and she let him, and there was nothing trembling or uncertain about it. Just the solid warmth of his hand around hers and the late September light going gold over the ridge. "I haven't told you directly," he said. "I know. I should." "Yes," she said, "you should." He turned to look at her, and his face was open in a way she had not seen before, without the careful management that people put on their faces when they are protecting something. "I love you, Elsie," he said. "I don't know exactly when it started. Somewhere around the time you held that fence post with one hand while threading wire with the other and told me the story of the Pratt fence dispute without missing a step, and I thought, there is no one in the world like this person, and I was right, there isn't." She was quiet for a long moment. Her hand was still in his. "I love you," she said. "I have been reasonably clear on that since July, but I was not certain I was going to say it yet." "Why not yet?" "Because I wanted to be sure I wasn't making a decision from loneliness." He nodded slowly. "That's a fair thing to check." "It's not loneliness," she said. "I have lived alone for 10 years and I have been lonely in it, that's true, but this is not that. This is you specifically. This is who you are specifically." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, and she felt the warmth of that all the way to her sternum. They sat until the light was gone and the stars came out. October brought the sharp, clean cold that announced winter was coming seriously, and the ranch moved into its preparation mode, which Elsie ran like a general because she had learned the first winter that unpreparedness in October was a catastrophe in February. The men worked long days cutting and stacking hay, repairing winter shelter for the cattle, checking every fence line on the property, laying in supplies. Amos worked with the same focused energy he always brought, and the difference now was that in the evenings there were small, deliberate moments between them that the work of the day had not allowed. A hand rested briefly on her shoulder as he passed, a look across the yard that held something private and warm. Clara watched her mother's face in these weeks and was quietly satisfied with what she saw. Elsie Sullivan's face had always been beautiful in its strength and certainty, but it was different now. There was something softer in the certainty, not weaker, just more open, the way land looks after rain. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October when Amos and Elsie walked together along the south fence line after dinner, as had become their habit, and he stopped at the point where the fence met the creek, and the cottonwood trees had gone gold, and the light was doing something extraordinary with the water, and he turned to her. He did not kneel in the theatrical way she had heard about from women in town, but he reached into the pocket of his coat and brought out a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, and he held it between his fingers and looked at her with the complete steadiness that was the truest thing about him. "I know you don't need a partner," he said. "I know you have managed every difficult thing this life has offered you through your own strength and your own judgment, and you are not a woman who requires rescue. I'm not offering rescue, I'm offering myself. My work and my honesty and whatever years I have ahead of me spent here on this land beside you. I would like to marry you, Elsie, if you want that." The cottonwood leaves moved in the cold air. The creek said its clear, constant thing over the stones. "I want that," she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. She looked at it on her hand against the background of the creek and the gold trees, and she felt a happiness that was not giddy or frantic but was enormous, a deep, settled, completed feeling, like a lock turning over. He kissed her for the first time then beside the creek in the cottonwood light, and it was not hurried and it was not tentative, and it was very much like every other thing he did, completely present and entirely right. Clara's reaction when they told her that evening was to burst into tears, which surprised all three of them, including Clara, who wiped her eyes fiercely and said she was not crying. She simply had something in her eye, and Amos handed her his handkerchief, and she took it with considerable dignity and blew her nose, and then said, with perfect composure, that she thought this was the best news she had heard in her life, and Elsie put her arm around her daughter and held her hard for a moment. Rogelio was told the next morning. He received the news with a nod and a long look at Amos, and then he extended his hand to him, and Amos shook it. And that was the entire ceremony of Rogelio's blessing, which was worth considerably more than most speeches. Helen Graves was told via a letter that was followed within 3 days by Helen herself, appearing at the ranch in her wagon with a pie and tears, and a great deal of warm and articulate happiness that filled the kitchen for an entire afternoon. The wedding was held in December at the Millhaven Church, and it was not an elaborate event because neither Elsie nor Amos had any taste for elaborate events. But it was warm, and it was full of people who had watched Elsie Sullivan run this ranch alone for 10 years, and who were glad to see her standing at the front of the church with her chin up and her hands steady, and a happiness on her face that was not performed. Rogelio sat in the front row beside Clara, and Will Castor and Danny Forsyth and Helen Graves and her husband. And when Reverend Graves read the vows, Rogelio kept his eyes on the floor, but he was smiling, just slightly, in a way that Elsie saw and that she kept in her memory forever afterward. Amos spoke his vows in a clear, even voice. He had not written anything elaborate. He spoke the traditional words and then added simply that he intended to honor this woman and this land with everything he was for as long as he had, and that he knew the land had been in good hands before he came, and that he was not here to take anything from it but to add what he could. Elsie's eyes were bright, but she did not cry. She spoke her vows in a voice that did not waver, and she held his hands and she looked at his face, and she felt the enormous, quiet rightness of it, the feeling of a long journey arriving somewhere. Douglas Sullivan, her late husband's brother, had been informed of the marriage by letter, and had sent a civil response that acknowledged it without enthusiasm, which was all she required of him. Gerald Pratt heard about it in town and said nothing publicly, which was also all she required of him. The winter of 1892 to 1893 was hard, which winters in Wyoming always were, but it was a different kind of hard than the winters Elsie had weathered alone. Not easier in the physical sense. The work was exactly as demanding as it had always been, but different in the nightly sense, in the sense of coming inside from the cold to a kitchen that was warm with more than fire, in the sense of lying awake listening to the wind against the windows and having that no longer be a solitary experience. Amos learned the Sullivan Ranch from its western corners to its eastern boundaries with the same systematic, attentive thoroughness he brought to every project. And by February, he knew every gate and every difficult section of fence and every water hole and every particular habit of every animal on the property. He did not manage any of it separately from Elsie. They talked through every decision over the kitchen table in the mornings, and it became natural quickly, the way real partnerships become natural, because neither of them needed the other to be small. There was one evening in January when Gerald Pratt came to the ranch on a pretense of discussing a strayed calf that had been found on the Sullivan South fence, and he spoke primarily to Amos during the conversation, addressing his remarks to him as if Elsie were not present. Elsie watched this happen with an expression of mild interest. When Pratt had made his point about the calf, which was minor and easily resolved, Elsie addressed the resolution directly to him, in the clear, businesslike way she had always conducted herself with Pratt, and Amos said nothing at all, just stood beside her and let her handle it as she obviously intended to, and Pratt left with the same sourness of expression he had always left with. In the barn afterward, Elsie said to Amos, "Thank you for not speaking for me." "I thought you had it well in hand," he said. "I did," she said, "but not everyone would have let me." "Then not everyone was paying attention," he said, which was both simple and precisely right. Spring came, and with it the work expanded again, and Elsie's plans for the ranch expanded with it. She had been considering, for 3 years, whether to build a proper drying barn for winter feed storage that would allow her to take advantage of a larger summer cutting, and with Amos's practical input on the construction specifics, they worked through the plans that winter and broke ground in April. The building took most of the spring, with Amos and Will and Rogelio doing the majority of the carpentry, and it was finished and in use by August, and the improvement in their feed storage capacity was immediate and substantial. Rogelio's health had continued to be a subject of attention. He was 63 now, and his knees were bad through the winter months, and his stamina was less than it had been. He refused to slow down in any way that reduced his dignity, which Elsie respected, and Amos had quietly arranged the daily work so that Rogelio's tasks were always achievable without strain, in a way that was so natural it did not look arranged. Elsie saw this and was grateful for it in a way that she expressed to Amos privately one evening, telling him it was one of the kindest things she had seen a person do for another. "He has given this ranch everything for 12 years, Amos said. "He deserves to finish well." The spring drive of 1893 was the largest the Sullivan Ranch had ever run, 94 head, and it went without significant difficulty, and sold at a price that, when Elsie sat down with the accounts book that evening, left her sitting back in her chair with her hands in her lap feeling a long, slow tide of satisfaction moving through her. The numbers on the page were the result of 10 years of work under her own hand and 1 year of partnership that had built on that foundation without disturbing it, and they were very good numbers. The ranch was not merely surviving. It was growing, steadily and with intention, in the exact direction she had always meant it to grow. She told Amos the figures across the kitchen table and watched his face open into a genuine, unguarded smile, and he said, "Elsie Sullivan, you are something." "Elsie Blackwell," she said, and felt the small, surprising pleasure of using the name, as she still occasionally did, as if testing its weight, finding it good. Clara had ridden the drive with them that spring for the second time, 16 and then 17 and now approaching 18 with the same purposeful stride she applied to everything. And she had negotiated the sale of 4 horses at the Rawlins market on her own authority, on commission, while Elsie and Amos handled the cattle. She sold all 4 horses at a price that made the buyer smile and come back the following morning to ask about the Sullivan horses in general and whether there were more available. And Clara handled that inquiry with the composed pleasure of someone who knew she had done well and did not need to be theatrical about it. In the summer of 1893, Elsie discovered she was pregnant. She was 42 years old, which was late by any reasonable measure, and she sat with this knowledge for 3 days before telling Amos, wanting to be certain before she said anything aloud. She was certain. She was also, once the initial surprise had settled, deeply and quietly glad. She told him on a Sunday morning before Clara was up, in the kitchen, with her coffee cup in her hands and the sun just beginning to come through the east window, and she watched his face go through the stages of understanding and then watched the joy arrive in it, not tentative or complicated but clear and full. And he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her and held her for a long time without saying anything. "Are you well?" he said, finally, pulling back to look at her. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am 42 years old, which is a fact, but I am also extremely healthy, which is also a fact. Then I am the happiest man in the Wyoming territory," he said. Clara received the news with a moment of speechlessness that was extremely uncharacteristic, followed by the most enthusiastic hug she had given her mother since she was about 8 years old, and then a period of thoughtful and visibly excited planning that lasted approximately 3 weeks and included proposals for reorganizing the sleeping arrangements in the house, a list of equipment that would need to be acquired, and an inquiry into whether Helen Graves knew a reliable midwife who had attended complicated births. This last item delivered with such practical seriousness that Elsie started to laugh and could not entirely stop. "I will handle the midwife, Clara," she said. "I'm just organizing," Clara said. "I know you are," Elsie said. Rogelio was told and responded with his characteristic economy of expression and a gift, delivered the following day without ceremony, of a small wooden horse he had carved himself, smooth and well-formed, placed on the kitchen table without comment. Elsie kept it on the mantelpiece for the rest of her life. The pregnancy was, as Elsie had told Amos it would be, not a reason to stop working. She modified the more physically demanding elements of her daily routine as the months advanced, with a practicality that drove the Millhaven doctor, who had occasion to see her in October, to a state of mild professional exasperation. But she did not stop managing the ranch, and she did not stop writing the fence lines. She did accept Amos's help more freely than she might otherwise have, not because she needed to be managed, but because allowing it was a pleasure and she had stopped being suspicious of pleasure. They talked in the evenings about the child. Not in a sentimental way exactly, but in the way 2 practical people discuss a significant addition to a working enterprise, what it would mean for the schedule in spring, what it would mean for the finances, which were good, what it would mean for Clara, who would be 18 in March. And then, having handled the practical, they talked about it in the other way, in the way of 2 people who love each other and who are building something together and who feel the weight and the beauty of that plainly. "What do you want?" Amos asked her one night, lying in the dark, his hand resting on the curve of her abdomen. "For the child, yes. I want him to have your steadiness and my stubbornness," she said, "in roughly equal measure. You think it's a boy. I have no idea," she said, "but for the purposes of this conversation, him." "Him," Amos said, and she could hear the smile in it. The baby was born on a cold, clear morning in February of 1894, attended by a midwife named Ada Kloss, who had been practicing in Carbon County for 20 years, and who proceeded with the same no-nonsense efficiency that Elsie valued above almost everything. Amos waited in the kitchen and Clara waited with him, both of them entirely useless to each other in their anxiety, which Clara expressed by making coffee repeatedly and Amos by staring at the fire. When Ada Kloss opened the bedroom door and announced a healthy boy, Amos stood up so fast he knocked his chair back. Clara caught it automatically without looking, which was a piece of pure ranch reflexes, and then she started to cry again, which she also did without looking, with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has accepted that this is simply something that happens. The boy was named Thomas Amos Blackwell. Thomas for the man who had built this ranch and whose memory it honored, and Amos for the man who had come to it and added himself to it, and Blackwell for the family they had made. He was a large, healthy baby with dark eyes and a clear, strong cry, and Elsie held him in the clean morning light with Amos beside her, and felt, with complete and open certainty, that this was the fullest she had ever been. Amos held his son for the first time with the careful intensity of a man holding something he did not know he was capable of wanting this much, and Elsie watched him and felt a wave of love for him that was different from all the other kinds she had felt, larger in some dimension she did not have a name for. "Thomas Amos Blackwell," he said quietly, looking at the baby's face. "He looks like you," Elsie said. "He has your chin," Amos said. "That poor child," she said. He laughed, and the sound filled the room. Clara sat at the edge of the bed and looked at her brother with an expression of wondering seriousness. "Hello," she said to him, very quietly as if they were being introduced at a formal occasion. The baby regarded her with the unfocused serenity of the newly arrived. "I am your sister," she said. "I will teach you everything you need to know about this ranch, and our mother will teach you the rest." "And your father?" Amos asked. Clara looked at him steadily. "I was assuming that was the same category," she said. "What you teach." The room was quiet for a moment, and then something happened in Amos's face that Elsie had never quite seen before and that she would never forget. An expression she did not have a word for because it was made of too many things at once: gratitude and love and grief and healing and pure, solid happiness. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." The years that followed were the years Elsie had always been building toward, or had been without quite knowing it. Thomas grew into a child of enormous energy and curiosity, installed on the back of a horse before he was 2, and insisting on accompanying the morning feed checks before he was 4, shadowing Amos through every task with the single-minded dedication of a person who wants to learn everything, and wants to learn it now. He had his father's steadiness underneath, and his mother's refusal to accept a situation as impossible, which was a formidable combination. And Rogelio, who was now deeply delighted with the boy, told Elsie one morning that Thomas had the makings of a fine ranch hand, which Elsie relayed to Amos, and which Amos received with the particular quiet pride of a father hearing something entirely good about his child. Clara, who had turned 18 in March of 1894, and who had managed a significant portion of the spring horse sales on her own authority and done it brilliantly, made her intentions clear to her mother in the summer of that year. She intended to stay on the Sullivan Ranch, and she intended to expand the horse breeding program into a formal operation that was separate from and equal to the cattle operation. She laid this proposal before Elsie with a written business plan that was so thorough and so well-reasoned that Elsie read it twice and then handed it to Amos and asked him what he thought. "I think she's right," he said, after reading it carefully. "So do I," Elsie said. They gave Clara the go-ahead and the budget she requested, and within 2 years, the Sullivan Horse Program had developed a reputation that extended beyond Carbon County into neighboring territories, with buyers coming specifically for Sullivan horses and paying accordingly. Rogelio retired from active ranch work in the fall of 1895, at 65, when his knees finally made the decision for him. He did not leave the ranch. There was never any question of him leaving. Elsie converted one of the smaller rooms in the main house into a proper room for him, and he accepted it with the dignified gratitude of a man who has been valued correctly. And he spent his days in the manner of a man who has worked hard all his life and has earned the right to be still. He carved small wooden animals for Thomas, and he sat on the porch in good weather, and he advised from a sitting position, which was advice that Elsie and Amos always took seriously because he had earned the right to have it taken seriously. He died in the spring of 1897, quietly and at peace, in his room in the Sullivan Ranch house, with Elsie holding one hand and Thomas, 3 years old, inexplicably present and still, sitting beside the bed as if he understood, which no one entirely believed but no one could entirely argue with. They buried him on the east slope, not far from Thomas Sullivan's grave, and Elsie stood at his grave site with Amos beside her and Clara and Thomas, and felt the full weight of 12 years of partnership and respect, and she spoke a few words that were simple and true and entirely sufficient, which was what Rogelio would have wanted. In 1898, when Elsie was 47 and Amos was 46 and Thomas was 4, Elsie had another child, a girl she and Amos named Vera, who arrived with considerably less drama than Thomas and who from her first days had her father's dark eyes and her mother's absolute stillness when she was thinking, which made her look, even as an infant, like she was solving a problem. Thomas was ecstatic about Vera in the way of small children who cannot entirely explain their own enthusiasm, which manifested primarily as following her around the house at a distance of approximately 18 inches and narrating whatever was happening in their shared environment. Clara, 23, with a horse breeding business that was already paying its own way and showing promise of considerable more, held her half-sister for the first time and looked at Elsie with an expression that was composed entirely of love, and Elsie reached across and took her eldest child's hand and held it, and they stayed that way for a long moment, the four of them together in the afternoon light of the Sullivan Ranch bedroom, the Wyoming sky enormous and clear outside the window. By 1900, the Sullivan Ranch was 200 acres larger than it had been when Elsie inherited it, after she purchased the remaining acreage of the Finch property and the northern lot that had gone unclaimed since a failed homesteader had walked away from it in 1891. The herd was 230 head. The horse program was producing 12 horses a year, all of them spoken for before they were available. The buildings were well maintained and expanded. There was a proper schoolroom in the east wing of the house, because Elsie had insisted on proper schooling for her children, even when the Millhaven school had been inconsistent in its quality, and she had hired a young schoolteacher named Patience Drum who lived in Millhaven and rode out 3 days a week, and who was teaching Thomas to read with the same systematic energy that Thomas applied to everything, and who found Vera, at 2, already watching the lessons with terrifying focus. Will Castor had married and moved his family to a small homestead 10 miles east, but still worked the Sullivan drives every spring, out of loyalty and habit, and because the money was good. They had hired 2 new permanent hands, young men named Jim Haverford and Cal Brooks, who were good workers and who fit the rhythms of the ranch without disrupting them. The Millhaven that had watched Elsie Sullivan with skeptical eyes in 1882 had, over 18 years, largely made its peace with the fact that she had been correct and it had been wrong. The town did not say this directly, because towns rarely did, but it showed in the way people spoke to her, in the kind of respect that is extended not from politeness, but from the genuine acknowledgement of someone who has proved something. Gerald Pratt had sold his ranch in 1896 and moved to Cheyenne, which no one was particularly sorry about. Douglas Sullivan had died in Denver in 1893, and Elsie had written a brief, kind letter to his widow and felt the clean freedom of having no further obligation there. On a September evening in 1900, Elsie and Amos sat on the porch in the last warm light of the summer, Thomas 6 years old and finally persuaded to bed, Vera 2 and asleep in her room, Clara down at the horse barn doing something she would explain in the morning, the ranch quiet and full around them. "Are you satisfied?" Amos asked her. It was the kind of question he asked, practical and direct and meaning more than it said. She thought about it for a real moment, which was the kind of answer he deserved. "I am," she said. "Satisfied is the right word, not finished." "No," he said, "not finished, but satisfied." She looked out at the land, the south pasture in the last light, the creek catching the fading orange of the sky, the dark shapes of cattle moving slowly toward the water. The mountains in the distance, clear and cold and permanent, exactly as they had been when Thomas Sullivan had first brought her here 20 years ago, and she had stood on this porch and thought, with the uncomplicated directness of a young woman who did not yet know how much the land would ask of her. Yes. This. She had said yes to it then, and every year since she had said yes again, in every fence post and every branded calf and every winter survived and every spring arrived at, and the yes had accumulated into something enormous and specific and entirely hers. "In 1882, she said, 3 men stood at my husband's grave and told me this ranch would fail." "I know," Amos said. He had heard this before, not often, but he had heard it. "And then you came," she said, "after 10 years of me running it, and the first thing you said about it was that it was the finest spread you had ever seen." "It was," he said. "It is." She turned and looked at him, this man who had come to her gate on a Monday morning in April with 2 good letters and a gray horse and 21 years of skills, and who had stayed not because she needed saving but because she was worth staying for, and who had added himself to her life in the way that a good thing adds itself, not by replacing what is already there but by growing alongside it. "What made you stop at that gate?" she asked. She had never asked before. She was not sure why she was asking now, except that the evening was right for it. He thought about it. "The fence line," he said. "I had been riding from Millhaven and I had been looking at the spreads along the road. The way ranches are kept tells you everything about the person keeping them. The fences on this property were tight and properly maintained, and the corner posts were set deep, which is work that most ranchers put off because it's hard and they think they can get another season out of a soft post. Yours were set correctly. I wanted to know who kept their corner posts like that." She smiled. It was such a characteristically Amos answer, entirely material and entirely true, and somehow, through its truthfulness, more romantic than anything that was trying to be romantic. "And," she said, "and I found out," he said. "Took me most of a year to find out completely. But I did." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him and felt the solid warmth of him against the cooling evening air, and the ranch was all around them, breathing and alive and deeply, permanently theirs. Clara came up from the horse barn with a lantern, saw her parents on the porch, and gave a wave that was entirely unsentimental and full of love, and went inside. The sky above the ridge was full of stars. The creek ran in the dark. The cattle were settled for the night. The corner posts were deep and tight. Everything was exactly as it should be, and everything was just beginning. Elsie Sullivan Blackwell looked at her land and at her life, and felt the particular, enormous satisfaction of a person who was told something was impossible, and who had, with patient and daily and relentless effort, proved otherwise, and who had then found, in the proof of it, something better and larger than she had known to plan for. She pressed her lips to Amos's jaw, warm and rough in the dark, and she said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying, and the night held them, and the ranch held them, and the Wyoming sky went on and on above it all, indifferent to everything except what endured. They sat until the lanterns in the house went out one by one and the only light was the stars, and then they went inside together, and the door closed, and the porch was empty, and the sound of the land at night was the only sound, which was more than enough.